So this is a tutorial about how to do a single welt pocket. So your patterns will include your welt, obviously, and then your pocket bag, and then whatever you're sewing it onto. So this will be my project. So let's just say this is a jacket, for instance. So you can see my pocket bag is white. So naturally, if your pocket bag was to hang open a bit, you're going to see your pocket bag. So sometimes patterns will actually include a little bit of their self fabric. The self fabric is just your outer fabric and your main fabric that you're using. Some will actually include a little strip that will cover the top of your pocket bag. So it'll be sewn on to the top of your pocket bag just like that. Sometimes it's even like sewn onto the pocket bag. Most of the time it's sewn on just to the top of it. And that will help, like when it opens up, you're just gonna see red instead of the white. So regardless if you have those two pieces or not, you're gonna sew those together right now. Make sure that you've fused the back side of your welt, not your front side, the back side of your welt pocket. Mine's a good 2 inches. My welt is 1 inch wide. So we fused that, and then we're going to make sure that we've also fused our welt. So for drafting purposes, if you wanted to draft your own, my welt is going to be 5 inches wide and 1 inch tall. So then my welt piece is going to be, so you see I have, this is my center fold line. On either side, it will be 1 inch, and then my seam allowance is 1/2 inch. So the width of this is 3. So you see I have 1/2 inch seam allowance, then I have 1 inch, then I have my other inch, and then I have another 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then the width of that, because my seam allowance is 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch longer on each side, so that will equal 6. Your pocket bag is the same width as your welt, and then however long you want it to be, keep in mind that it's obviously folded in half. It's just basically this giant rectangle. So with all your pieces prepped and fused, we've folded our welt in half. Now for sewing purposes, I've drawn my seam allowance, because when you go to sew this on, you don't necessarily have something telling you how wide your seam allowance is. So it helps when you draw it onto your welt and your pocket bag. And then I've also marked the width of my welt. So you're going to mark this center, just like I did on my welt. You're going to mark the center. This will help you line up everything perfectly. So 6 inches wide, it's going to be 3. And then I'm also going to mark where I'm stopping, where I'm starting and stopping. So I know that that is now 5 inches wide. Now it does help to go all the way to the edge, because that's what's going to line up to your welt line. So with my welt drawn on, I've also marked where I'm starting and stopping, and then I've marked the center. And this will help when we go and sew everything on. We know where everything lines up. So now that we have all of our marks on our welt and our self fabric and our pocket, we're going to sew along our seam allowance between the start and the stop. To make it more accurate, you can lower your stitch length. I'm using a stitch length 2. So now that we have those lines sewn, we're going to flip our project over. So I'm going to draw right in the center of these 2 lines. My welt is 1 inch wide, so it's 1/2 inch from one of my stitching lines. If you don't have a grid ruler, I highly suggest getting one. They are not expensive, and they're really nice to mark the center lines of anything with a rectangle or a square. Okay, so I can see my two ends on either side. So I'm going to go 1/2 inch because 1/2 inch is my seam allowance. 1/2 inch on either side of those new lines. Then I'm going to angle it. Okay, so you're going to cut down this center line, and then you're going to cut right to that stitching line. You don't want to go past it. That's how you get holes. But if you don't go close enough, that's how you get tucks. Your iron is your best friend with a welt. You can iron out most tucks, but you can't really hide a hole. So making sure that you're not cutting anything on the other side. I like to fold it in half first, and then I can put my scissors underneath. So now that that's cut, we're gonna flip this over and we're gonna push everything through to the wrong side of the fabric. Your welt starts on the right side of your fabric. I don't know if I mentioned that at the very beginning, but your welt will always start on the right side of your fabric. All right. So now we can give it a little press. The first thing I like to press is the top of my pocket bag. And that just helps this seam lay flat for when we finish our triangles. All right, so now we're gonna sew down our little triangles. So don't get discouraged when you first flip it inside out because it might look like it has little tucks, but it's just because we haven't finished everything yet. With your welt sitting face up, so this is your self fabric, this is the right side of the fabric. We're now gonna flip it over so we can reveal our little triangle. Make sure that you're not catching your pocket bag. It loves to flip down. Make sure you're not gonna catch your pocket bag, the top of your pocket bag. Okay, so now we're just, you can actually see my line from when I drew that earlier, and that's exactly where we're going to go down. You wanna make sure that you're not catching this fabric or else you're actually gonna have a tuck. And then you wanna make sure that you're not sewing too far away from that line because you'll have little holes in your corners. So you wanna make sure that you're pulling your welt right up into that top corner or else you'll have a little space and no one wants to see that. And then we're going to repeat that with the other side. So with our piece facing up, flipping that side over and finding our little triangle. So pulling your welts a little bit more, obviously not too much or it's going to look like that, but you can pull it slightly so it's just not gaping. And then sewing down the triangle just like we did on the other side. So welts love a good firm press. Obviously, if your fabric is prone to shining, you're definitely going to want to use a press cloth for this. So getting right into those corners. I mean, this totally looks like it could have been a tuck, but it's easily able to get pressed out. Like, look at that. So if you want to top stitch your welt, do this now, because if we did it after we closed the pocket bag and you were to, see this is the top of the welt, if you were to top stitch just like here for say, it's going to go right through your pocket bag and then you're not going to be able to get in that. So now we're going to finish our pocket bag. So flipping our project over, this is the top of our welt. This is the bottom of our welt. We're going to take that pocket bag and we're going to sew it onto the bottom of our welt. So we're just sewing it on flat like this. So flipping your pocket bag up, finding that edge, the bottom edge of the welt, and we're just sewing it on right like that. Now you don't need the 1/2 inch. You're probably not going to be able to get the 1/2 inch or whatever your seam allowance is, because that's where your welt is sewn. You can just use the edge of the foot. You can use a serger. Say for instance, your project doesn't have a lining. You're going to want to clean finish all the sides of the pocket bag with a serger. So lining up the bottom of my pocket bag with the bottom of the welt, pinching that together, and then I can just flip that over and then serge all of those layers together. Now I'll serge the top edge of my pocket bag. And the sides. Now we can give everything a final press. Now, if you're doing an angled welt and your pocket bag has a bit of a curve to it, it's going to be sewn the exact same way, but you're going to have 2 different pocket bags, and one's going to be slightly shorter and one's going to be slightly longer. The shorter one is the one that's going to attach to the bottom of the welt, and then the longer one is going to be the one that attaches to the top of the welt. And if you're drafting this yourself, you're going to draw your line where you'd like your welt onto the right side of your fabric. So we're drawing it at an angle, and then we're going to mark, you can mark the start and end first, or you could mark the center first. Like that, and that is the placement of our pocket plus seam allowance on either side. I'm drafting this like the same size that we did our welt for this pocket. So it's 3 inches wide by 6, which means this is 5 inches wide, and then this is 1 inch wide. Now for our pocket bag, you're going to draw it the same width as your welt. So imagine this is my pocket bag. Now, one of the pockets, you'll have 2 pockets, and one of them is going to match the bottom, is going to sew to the bottom of the welt, and then the other one, your top one, is going to match to the top of your welt. So one of them is going to be longer than the other. Because my welt, so this is the center of my welt. Imagine that this would be the center of this line. I need to add 1/2 inch because that's half the width. So it would be 1/2 inch, and then I need to add another 1/2 inch to be able to reach the seam allowance of that welt. So we're adding 1 inch to the top of our welt placement. And then the bottom of your pocket bag reaches your welt placement line. So your top one's going to be this line. It's going to go all the way around. And then your bottom pocket bag is going to be cut at that placement line all the way around. Now, because we didn't use the full 1/2 inch seam allowance when we sewed on the bottom of our pocket bag, it's only about 1/4 inch. You can adjust it and trim off 1/4 inch if you like, or you can just serge your pocket bags to match afterwards.